Young people believe unemployment, abuse of power, greed, and low or no income are the major drivers of corruption. They also believe the South African Police Service and the local government sphere are the most corrupt institutions in the country. This was revealed in a report titled Our Future is Not for Sale. To help me unpack the findings of the report, I'm joined now by researcher at Corruption Watch, Melusi Ngala. Melusi, good evening, and thank you very much for joining us tonight on the Newsfeed Late Night. Tell me, first and foremost, when this report was commissioned.
This report was commissioned this year during May and June, during the lockdown, strict lockdown period, of course. And it comprises of 1,500 respondents, all of them from across South Africa, different groups, and between the ages of 18 and 35 years old.
What exactly was the aim? What did you want to find out?
So, as members of the public already know that we as Corruption Watch encourage members of the public to report incidents of corruption to us. And over the years, we have realized that the youth are plagued by corruption in relation to the issuing of licenses, but also in education, the issues of sextortion and bribery, and also then, of course, accessing basic services. So the hypothesis was that, we need to understand on a deeper level what's actually going on in terms of the youth. How do they perceive corruption? What are the causes? And what are the general thoughts, of course, in terms of how can we address corruption going forward?
What is their understanding of what corruption is?
It varies. So one of the key questions that we asked was for respondents to actually identify forms of corruption. And people generally in the higher income group identified all the scenarios as corruption, whereas people in the low income groups, about a third of them didn't, identified a third of the scenarios as corruption. But generally, all of the youth seem to have an understanding that, they describe corruption as bribery as well as some form of criminal act.
Yeah. And what do they perceive as the drivers of corruption?
Well, it's as you mentioned in your introduction, Tabo, it's abuse of power, but beyond that, we're talking about people that are living in communities, the most impoverished communities in our society, some of them. So they are realizing what money can do for you. So you find that police officers always will often require people to give some form of a bribe if they want to be protected, or municipal officials will ask for money if people want basic services. But the same also goes for when we look at education. There are officials there who will, or teachers at least, that will ask for sexual favors from students.
Now, the very same young people would be willing to pay a bribe for employment. Do they see that as corruption? Do they view that as corruption? And why would they still be willing to go ahead and pay that bribe?
It's a very complicated matter in that they do recognize it as corruption, but they view it as what can a person do under these circumstances? These are tough economic times, and going with that, of course, is the fact that it appears that employers always want to exploit that fact that, if you want some kind of job, especially in government or in the private sector, in some instances, people will then ask you to actually pay a bribe if you want to secure that spot.
Now, let's take this a little bit further. You mentioned earlier, you said young people generally did not trust politicians and big business. Let's stay with the trust on a trust deficit on politicians. Does that in any way deter them in participating in political processes, for example, political party formations, or even in voting?
The study did not explore that aspect, Tabo, but interestingly enough, right? So when you look at what happened, during the extreme lockdown levels, there was the issue of food parcels, and about 83% of the respondents indicated that, there was some irregularities in relation to that. But about 50%, or just under 50%, said a person had to be affiliated to a political party to be able to get a food parcel. So, to them, that was quite discouraging.
Yeah. And generally, do they feel that corruption is worse now than probably it was, let's say, 8 years ago?
Yeah, that is an indicator that also came through quite strongly, that, especially 67% of the respondents said they are more, that, corruption in relation to service delivery, at least they're willing to participate in that. But yes, they do feel that compared to what situation was, at least a large majority of them, while 22%, feel that, things have remained the same, and 17% that things have changed slightly.
Yeah. Very briefly, Melusi, I'm going to let you go in a moment because I'm going to take a break. But I want to end on this note. Do they believe that young people can play a role in fighting corruption?
Yeah, I mean, it's one of those questions that I would like to answer in the following way, Thabo. On the one hand, the youth definitely believes that, there's a role that they can play in terms of whistleblowing, and always that's encouraging. But on the other hand, there are red flags for us to take note of, because most of the participants more participants who had participated in some form of corruption in years gone by, they are more than willing to participate in corruption in the future, because they view it as a means of survival. They need it for protection, and also they need it for job security.
Corruption Watch researcher there, Melusi Ngala, appreciate your time. Thank you for joining us tonight on the Newsfeed Late Night.